David stood frozen in the middle of Melanie's cafe, unable to process what he was witnessing. He had only come in to help his wife. One of the staff hadn't shown up, and he didn't want her facing the rush alone. But he never expected to become the target of Ruth's sharp tongue and cold entitlement. Her voice echoed through the room as she insulted him over the smallest inconvenience, treating him like he was beneath her, like he didn't even deserve to stand behind the counter. Customers stared. Melanie's hands trembled, and David, a man who rarely let anything get under his skin, felt something crack deep inside him. What Ruth didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that this humiliating outburst would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. How could a single moment of cruelty unravel years of secrets, legacies, and hidden truths? What power did David truly hold, and why would Ruth soon regret ever crossing him that day? The answers might surprise you, but before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's uncover how this story truly began. David Morrison adjusted his tie with the same care he used when preparing a multi-million-dollar client presentation. Except today, instead of stepping into a boardroom, he slipped on a dark apron embroidered with Melanie's Cafe in gentle cursive. The smell of freshly ground beans curled through the air, warm and grounding, and he inhaled deeply. He had exactly 1 hour before his 4 p.m. meeting, enough time, he hoped, to help Melanie survive the lunch rush. One of her baristas had called in sick that morning, and the cafe was already humming with impatient footsteps and clinking porcelain. Melanie emerged from the kitchen, cheeks flushed with gratitude and stress. She cupped his face and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "You're a lifesaver, baby," she murmured. "Just until 3 p.m., then you can go prep for your meeting." David smiled, soft, genuine, the kind of smile he only showed her. "You know I love this. Besides, making coffee relaxes me before big appointments." He rolled up his sleeves, exposing forearms dusted with faint freckles, and stepped behind the espresso machine with practiced ease. His hands moved instinctively, adjusting the grinder, tapping the portafilter, feeling the texture of the beans as if sensing their temperament. The hiss of steaming milk and the rhythmic tapping of metal against metal formed a kind of music, one he had never grown tired of. The cafe filled quickly. Business professionals in tailored suits, local residents in athleisure, mothers with strollers, each stepping inside with their own world of worries, expectations, and demanding drink orders. David greeted them all with warmth, offering a comforting presence amid the midday chaos. His calm steadiness softened even the sharpest moods. He fell into a familiar rhythm, the world narrowing to creamer streaks on wooden counters, swirling latte art, and the comforting heat radiating from the espresso machine. It grounded him, it made him feel human. At 2:45 p.m., the bell over the door chimed, and a gust of cold December air swept in. Ruth Whitmore entered like she owned the room, chin lifted, posture rigid, wrapped in a soft blue designer dress that whispered wealth with every movement. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, turning heads even before she spoke. She froze the moment she saw him. Her expression collapsed from polite neutrality into visible, unfiltered disgust. The transformation was immediate, almost theatrical. Her lips curled, her brows arched. She recoiled as though David himself were the stench of something spoiled. "I can't stomach having him close," she announced loudly, loud enough that conversations faltered and several customers looked up. Her friend Carolyn, hovering lowly at her side, blinked in confusion. "Ruth, what?" Ruth pointed at David with manicured precision, voice rising like a siren. "Does the owner know they have this serving customers in a place like this?" David's hand paused mid-pour, a drop of espresso trembling at the spout before falling silently into the cup. His practiced smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of hurt he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Ruth continued, her voice slicing through the air. "I just moved to this neighborhood expecting quality. Not this." The cafe went silent, even the espresso machine seemed to hush. From the back office, Melanie rushed forward, her anger already blooming across her face. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "is there a problem?" Ruth waved a hand dismissively, like brushing off an inconvenience. "Yes, there's a problem. I refuse to be served by." But David didn't wait to hear the rest. He quietly set the coffee pot down, carefully removed his apron, and stepped away from the counter. He said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. He simply walked toward the storage room, shoulders stiff, trying to retain a dignity that felt suddenly heavy and unbearably fragile. Ruth watched him go with a triumphant smirk. "Carolyn, take photos," she instructed, as if documenting evidence of a crime. "For the neighborhood association, they need to know about this." The camera shutter clicked once, twice, 3 times. Inside the storage room, the air was cooler, dimmer. Stacks of coffee bags lined the walls, and David leaned against them, steadying himself. His hands trembled not from anger, exactly, but from that quiet, aching humiliation that sinks deep before the brain even understands what happened. Outside, muffled voices rose again. Ruth's laughter, customers whispering, Melanie demanding she stop. David exhaled slowly, chest tightening. His phone buzzed, a reminder appearing on the screen. "Meeting with our Whitmore for PM today." Whitmore Estate. He stared at the name glowing on the display, the irony so sharp it felt surreal. A strange calm washed over him, not cold, not angry, but clarifying, like a fog lifting. Of all people, Ruth Whitmore. The very woman who had just tried to tear him down in front of an entire cafe was his for PM client, and she had no idea. He closed his eyes, a new kind of resolve settling over him, quiet but powerful. In the other room he heard Melanie's voice, protective, furious on his behalf. He loved her for that, but right now, something deeper was forming inside him. Not revenge, not pride, something steadier, something earned. He stood straighter, slipping his phone back into his pocket. This meeting, this unexpected collision of worlds, was going to be interesting. The storage room felt colder than it should have, as if the air itself had absorbed the sting of Ruth's words. David leaned against the stacked burlap bags of coffee beans, their earthy aroma wrapping around him like a reminder of steadiness, of something grounded and real. He inhaled deeply, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate waves as he tried to settle the tremor in his hands. His thoughts echoed in fragments, her voice, the contempt in every syllable, the laughter, the way the cafe had gone still as the humiliation settled over him like dust. He swallowed, jaw tightening. He wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly, he felt small, which was a feeling he hadn't confronted in years. A soft rustle at the doorway pulled him from the spiral. Melanie stepped inside, her presence worn even in the dim light. She didn't say anything at first. She simply walked up to him and wrapped her arms around his torso, pressing her cheek against his chest, as though trying to shield him with her own body. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking at the edges. "I should have thrown her out the second she opened her mouth." David let out a long breath and lowered his head, brushing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Her hair smelled faintly of rosemary and flower, the scent of someone who built comfort with her hands. "It's not your fault," he murmured, his voice quiet but steady. "Some people just, they can't see past what's in front of them." Melanie tightened her arms around him. "You didn't deserve that, not even for a second." He held her a moment longer, feeling her heartbeat against his. Then he slowly pulled back and glanced at his watch. 2 hours until the meeting. 2 hours until he would walk into Ruth Whitmore's world, not as a barista she looked down on, but as the financial advisor who oversaw the very inheritance she flaunted around town. He exhaled once more, this time calmer. "I'll be okay," he said softly. Melanie looked unconvinced, but she nodded. Outside, the muffled chaos of the cafe reached them, voices raised, chairs scraping, the unmistakable sharp tone of Ruth still tangled in confrontation. David placed a hand on the small of Melanie's back, and together they stepped out of the storage room. The moment they entered, the scene unfolded with startling clarity. Ruth stood near the counter, one hand planted dramatically on her hip, the other pointing angrily toward a tray of pastries. Her voice carried through the room like the shriek of metal scraping tile. "I want compensation," she declared loudly. "Do you hear me? I suffered emotional trauma in this establishment. The least you can do is offer free pastries. All of them, preferably. It's the bare minimum." Several customers exchanged bewildered glances. Someone sighed loudly, another muttered something under their breath. And then, from the corner table, her cane leaning against her chair, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly regular with steel-gray curls and a heart shaped by decades of seeing people for who they truly were, pushed herself to her feet. She straightened slowly, dignity radiating from her tiny frame. "Young lady," she said with a voice that carried more weight than volume, "that man has more class in his pinky than you have in your entire body." Gasps rippled softly through the room. Ruth's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. Her face flushed a deep, furious red. "Mind your own business, you old," but she didn't get to finish. Carolyn, cheeks red with embarrassment, grabbed Ruth's arm with both hands. "Come on," she whispered urgently, "we are already late for your appointment. Let's go." Now, Ruth jerked her arm free but allowed herself to be guided toward the door, muttering curses under her breath. She cast one last glare over her shoulder, as if promising some petty revenge no one cared about. The bell above the door chimed sharply as she exited. David's gaze followed them through the front window. Outside, the wind lifted a strand of Ruth's perfectly set hair, and she swatted at it as though offended by nature itself. Carolyn continued to tug her along the sidewalk. Their silhouettes moved farther and farther away until they turned the corner. A strange calm settled over him, soft, centered, no longer fragile, not victory, but clarity. As though something long dormant inside him had clicked back into place. He felt Melanie beside him, her hand brushing his. "I need to go," he said gently, "that meeting I mentioned. It's going to be interesting." Melanie studied his face. There was something different in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in years, a quiet confidence. The same quiet fire he carried in the early days of their relationship, when he was juggling his MBA, night shifts, and dreams bigger than the world wanted to allow. She touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the faint stubble there. "I know," she whispered, "and I trust you." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers for one still, grounding second. Then he stepped away, picking up his coat from the hook by the door. As he walked out of the cafe, the winter sun caught the edge of his glasses, sending a thin gold reflection across the window pane. Melanie watched him go, feeling something shift not only in him, but around him, as though life itself was preparing for a reckoning they had never expected. She whispered to herself, "Show her who you are, baby." And David, already halfway down the street, felt the wind brush against his face like a quiet promise. The humiliation was over. The real story was just beginning. The Whitmore estate rose from the landscape like a monument built to declare superiority rather than beauty. Its sprawling lawn stretched outward in symmetrical precision, each blade of grass trimmed to the exact same height. Rows of hydrangeas lined the stone pathway, their blossoms unnervingly perfect, as if nature itself had been coached into behaving. Marble statues stood like pale sentinels along the garden edges, watching every arrival with silent, hollow judgment. David stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The air smelled faintly of pine, fresh-cut grass, and something sugary, perhaps the pastries Whitmore's had delivered daily from one of the city's most exclusive bakeries. He adjusted the strap of his laptop bag and walked toward the imposing front door. Before he could knock, it opened with practiced grace. James, the Whitmore butler, stood framed in the doorway. Tall, composed, dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit, he carried an aura of calm professionalism that softened the mansion's intimidating formality. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison," James said with gentle warmth. "Mr. Chen speaks very highly of you." David offered a polite smile. "That's kind of him. Chen's one of the best CPAs I've worked with." James stepped aside, allowing him in. The floor was an expansive cathedral of marble, the air cool and scented faintly with lemon polish. Sunlight poured through vaulted windows, reflecting off polished white floors in shimmering patterns. Expensive art adorned the hallways, old portraits, sculptures, abstract paintings that probably cost more than most houses. David followed James down a long corridor, their footsteps echoing in a rhythmic, steady cadence. Every few feet, the hallway opened into some additional wing, a music room with a grand piano, a dining room long enough to host state dinners, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a sliding ladder. The grandeur was almost suffocating. David felt the old familiar contrast between worlds tug at him: this estate, dripping with inherited wealth, versus the cozy warmth of Melanie's cafe, where the floor creaked and the walls held stories instead of price tags. He pushed the thought aside. Today wasn't about the past, today was about truth. James led him to a pair of heavy mahogany doors and opened them silently. The study was dimmer than the rest of the house, lit by soft golden lamps and a wide-arched window overlooking the garden. A mahogany desk dominated the center, its surface smooth and immaculate. A leather chair sat behind it, angled slightly, as though its owner had just stood moments before. David approached the desk, setting his laptop and neatly organized files on its surface. He moved with quiet precision, a practiced grace born from years of presenting to clients who could make or break fortunes with a single phone call. Here, in this polished room, he felt himself slipping back into the version of him the world respected. The strategist, the numbers man, the quiet force who managed millions without a hint of ego. As he arranged his materials, James cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Whitmore should arrive shortly," he said. "She's been quite anxious about this meeting." David paused, letting the word settle. Anxious, the same woman who had humiliated him in front of a cafe full of strangers just 2 hours earlier. The irony tasted bittersweet. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm sure she has." James didn't react to the tone-trained neutrality etched into every gesture and excused himself with a polite bow of the head. When the door closed, the study fell into a serene hush. David sat down, pulling the Whitmore portfolio toward him. The thick binder opened with a familiar sound, like the rustle of opportunity. Charts, graphs, legal documents, and summaries filled the pages. $47 million in diverse holdings spread across real estate, tech stocks, municipal bonds, and a trust fund that quietly grew under his strategic management. He traced a finger along one of the graphs. 11% annual return, above industry average. He'd done well for them, very well. And they had no idea who the man behind the numbers truly was. His phone buzzed. He glanced down, and Melanie's message appeared on the screen. "Give him hell, baby." A slow, genuine smile unfurled across his face. He typed nothing in response, but he held the phone a moment longer than necessary, letting her words settle into him like armor. Then came the sound, footsteps, echoing down the hallway. Sharp, confident, entitled clicks of heels that announced presence before personality. The rhythm of someone who'd never once questioned whether the world would yield to her. David straightened in his chair, but kept his face relaxed. He didn't want anger to guide him. He wanted truth, and truth required calm. The footsteps grew louder. The door swung open. A gust of perfume rushed in before the woman herself, expensive, floral, overwhelming. Ruth breathed in sigh, phone pressed to her ear, her voice already mid-sentence. "Carolyn, I'll call you back. Time to meet the money man." She didn't even glance at David. She tossed her purse onto a chair with a careless flick, still scrolling through her phone screen with manicured fingers. "Hopefully this David Morrison is competent," she continued dismissively. "Daddy always said, never trust." Then she finally looked up. Her words died instantly. The color drained from her face in a slow, dramatic wash, as though someone had reached into her and pulled the arrogance straight out of her bloodstream. For the first time all day, David didn't feel small. He felt steady, grounded, seen, and Ruth looked like a woman who had just realized she'd tried to set fire to a house she didn't know she lived in. Ruth's phone slipped from her hand and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the study. For a moment neither of them moved. The device lay face down, its screen still glowing faintly, as if refusing to accept the abrupt end of her call. Ruth stood frozen, her breath caught somewhere between her spine and her throat. "You," she whispered. The word came out thin, like a thread pulled too tight and ready to snap. David rose slowly from his chair, movements controlled and deliberate, as if he'd rehearsed this moment not out of spite, but out of necessity. There was no triumph in his posture, no arrogance. Only a measured, composed certainty, the kind born from years of learning how to keep himself quiet so others could feel loud. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, pleasure to finally meet in person." Ruth's mouth opened, then closed, open again. She looked like someone draining for air, but finding the room suddenly unforgiving. Her pupils darted across his face, as if searching for some trick of the light, some illusion to explain away the impossible truth standing in front of her. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk until the knuckles whitened beneath her skin. "There must be some mistake," she managed, her voice trembling. You can't be. Your investment manager." David finished gently. "I assure you, I am." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm in his tone was steadier than any outburst could have been. Ruth staggered back a half step and finally allowed herself to collapse into the nearest chair. The sharp, posed confidence she'd worn like armor just that morning seemed to evaporate, leaving only a pale fragility beneath the layers of designer fabric. David sat again, opening his laptop with the quiet click that always brought him comfort. Numbers never judge, portfolios didn't sneer. Market charts didn't laugh at how he dressed or where he worked. He tapped a key, the screen illuminating his face. "Shall we begin?" he asked softly. "We have quite a bit to discuss regarding your portfolio." Ruth inhaled shakily, her fingers trembling as she reached for the water glass on the side table. The ice inside clinked against the crystal, betraying the shaking she tried so desperately to hide. She took a sip, but the water wobbled dangerously near the rim. Mr. Chen recommended you," she whispered, her voice far too small for a woman who had walked into a cafe earlier demanding respect like it was owed by birthright. "He did," David replied. "We've managed his family's wealth for 5 years, excellent returns. He speaks very highly of your father and wanted to ensure his daughter's estate remains stable." Ruth swallowed hard, the realization settling like a stone into her stomach. She had mocked him, insulted him, humiliated him in public. And now here he was not the man behind a counter serving cinnamon pastries and wiping tables, but the man guiding the flow of her fortune. Her face shifted through emotions as if every one of them demanded to be felt. Shock, because she couldn't reconcile the man from the cafe with the professional before her. Fear, because she suddenly understood she had no idea who she'd been belittling. Anger, flickering briefly as pride clawed at her throat. And finally, desperation, the kind that cracked through the layers she'd spent years constructing. "About this morning," Ruth began, her voice breaking before she could shape the next word. David looked up slowly, giving her the space to speak but not the comfort to hide. He didn't rescue her from the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle, let her confront the echoes of her own cruelty. She swallowed, her eyes darting around the room. The walls, once symbols of her family's wealth, now felt like witnesses to a truth she couldn't escape. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I understand," David said, but his tone was unreadable, not warm, not cold, simply factual. "You saw what you wanted to see." Ruth's breath hitched. "I wasn't myself." He tilted his head slightly. "Were you not?" Her eyes glistened in a way she tried desperately to hide behind lowered lashes, the first crack in her exterior. "I was frustrated, and you looked like a barista," David supplied gently. "Like someone beneath your attention." Ruth closed her eyes. Shame washed over her features, softening the sharp lines pride had carved there for so long. "I'm not a bad person," she murmured, almost pleading with herself more than with him. David's expression remained steady, calm. "You don't have to convince me of who you are, Mrs. Whitmore, but you should decide who you want to be." Her throat worked as she swallowed again, her fingers curling on her lap. For a moment she looked impossibly young, not in age, but in vulnerability. Like someone finally realizing the consequences of never questioning their own reflection. "I misjudged you," she said, voice cracking once more. "Yes," David replied softly, "you did." The truth hung in the air between them, not as a punishment, but as a necessary honesty. Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, then managed, barely, "Can we start over?" David considered her for a long, quiet moment. Not the version of her from the cafe, not the wealthy heiress whose name sat on the portfolio in front of him, but this version, the trembling, uncertain one, clutching the last remaining thread of her dignity. He closed his laptop gently. "That depends," he said. "Are you ready to listen this time?" Her breath shivered out of her. She nodded, small and sincere. And for the first time that day, something shifted, not in Ruth, not in David, but in the space between them. Something fragile, something unfinished. Something that could, with enough honesty, become the beginning of understanding. David lifted his hand gently, not in reprimand, but in a quiet request for a pause and an invitation to return to steadier ground. "Let's focus on business, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, keeping his voice calm, even. "Your father left you a substantial estate." The shift in his tone brought the room back into focus. The study, with its mahogany shelves and soft scent of polished wood, seemed to settle around them. He turned his laptop slightly so she could see the screen. Columns of numbers, careful charts, and color-coded trajectories filled the display with the quiet, objective truth of data. These, he continued, tapping a line of figures with the gentle precision of someone accustomed to guiding rather than lecturing, are your holdings in tech, real estate, and sustainable energy. 3 major sectors, balanced, resilient. Each chosen strategically. Ruth leaned forward slowly. Her posture was still unsteady, but she was trying to reclaim some form of composure, trying to stand again inside the version of herself she understood. She brushed a trembling strand of hair behind her ear. These numbers. She began, her voice wavering but not breaking. They're good. David shook his head gently, a small, almost imperceptible smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. They're excellent, he corrected softly. Your portfolio has grown 34% in the 18 months I've managed it. For a moment Ruth didn't react. She stared at the percentages, blinking as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more believable. Her lips parted slightly as she reread them, her mind slowly catching up with the magnitude of what he had just said. 18 months, she repeated, but I only started working with you 6 months ago. David's smile deepened just a fraction warm, but tinged with something more complicated. Your father hired me before he passed, he said quietly. He wanted to ensure you'd be taken care of. Ruth inhaled sharply, the sound fragile, almost childlike. Daddy knew you. Her voice wasn't polished now. Not controlled, just raw. David nodded, sitting back a little, not out of distance but out of respect for the weight of the memory he was about to share. He was a good man, he said. We'd meet for coffee every Tuesday, a little shop downtown. Ruth's hand lifted toward her face instinctively, as if trying to steady the sudden sting in her eyes. He loved that place, she whispered, said the barista made the best pour-over in Connecticut. David didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't remind her of the irony. He simply let the truth settle between them, patient, steady, inevitable, and then it hit her. The way a realization doesn't always strike all at once, sometimes it unfolds, blooming painfully behind the ribs, pulling breath away in slow, breaking waves. Her father's favorite coffee shop, his Tuesday ritual, his fondness for a barista who listened more than he spoke. Her gaze drifted upward, meeting David's eyes. It was him she hadn't known, couldn't have known. The man she had dismissed so easily, so cruelly, had been part of her father's quiet refuge, one of the last connections he'd nurtured before he died. Her lips trembled. You were, she swallowed hard. You were the one he talked about. David closed the laptop gently, shifting his full attention to her. He told me you had a good heart, he said softly. Deep down, that you just needed time to find it. Ruth's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She covered her face with both hands, fingers shaking violently. Her shoulders began to tremble, a small, quivering motion at first, as if she were trying to suppress it. But emotion, when it comes honestly, rarely asks permission. Her breath broke, and then the dam gave way. The sound that slipped from her wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was quieter than a whisper, just a fractured exhale, the kind one makes, and the weight of everything finally becomes too heavy to carry in silence. Tears streamed between her fingers as her shoulders shook with a helplessness she could no longer disguise. David didn't look away, he didn't move closer, didn't reach out. He also didn't leave her alone in it, he simply stayed, letting her grief exist without rushing to soften it. That was the thing her father had admired most. David understood when a heart needed room more than rescue. Ruth tried to catch her breath, but every inhale came uneven, threaded with pain she'd never allowed herself to feel, not when her father was sick, not at his funeral, not in the months after when she chose anger over mourning because anger was easier to carry. I didn't know, she whispered behind her hands, her voice trembling. I didn't know he trusted you. That he talked to you. David nodded slowly. He cared about you more than anything, he worried. But he believed you'd grow into yourself. Ruth let out another broken sound, half sob, half laugh at how little she had understood the world around her. And perhaps, how little she had understood herself. She lowered her hands just enough for her eyes to meet his again. They were red, swollen, vulnerable in a way she had spent her entire life avoiding. I was horrible to you, she whispered. This morning, all of it, David didn't let her finish. He didn't silence her, he simply met her gaze with a gentleness that made the rest of her apology unnecessary. "We'll deal with that," he said softly. "But for now, you needed to know the truth." Ruth nodded, a small, broken notion. And in that study between spreadsheets and grief, between regrets and revelations, something began to shift inside her. Not redemption, not yet. But the first crack in the walls she had built, and the first breath of air reaching a part of her heart she had long forgotten how to use. David slid the document across the polished mahogany, as if setting down a fragile thing that might shatter if handled too roughly. The paper caught the light and reflected a narrow strip of brightness between them. Ruth watched it move, eyes wide and hollowed by the earlier unraveling, as if each fold and staple carried weight she had not expected. "Your father included specific instructions in his will," David said quietly, his voice even, careful not to glow and careful not to soften the gravity of what he was about to say. He kept his hands visible on the desk, a small attempt to appear as unthreatening as the situation would allow. The air in the study felt dense, thick with consequence, with truth, with the brittle things people avoid until they cannot. Ruth's fingers trembled as she reached for the paper. Her breath came in shallow pulls, like someone trying to catch a sound that had slipped from her grasp. She read the legal language slowly, letting each clause land like a stone. The sentences were crisp, precise, written by lawyers who turned love and caution into enforceable reality. "What is this?" she asked finally, voice raw, a thin thread of disbelief braided with fear. David watched her for a moment before answering. "It's a morality clause," he said. He kept his voice soft because he thought gentleness might temper the sting of the words. "If I determine you're misusing the inheritance in ways contrary to your father's values, I have authority to restructure the trust." Ruth's head snapped up so quickly the motion seemed almost involuntary, a puppet jerking at an unseen string. "You can't do that," she protested, the force behind it revealing panic more than surprise, panic that her life might pivot on a decision she hadn't intended to face. David's expression tightened, the warmth he had maintained in previous minutes hardening like a shield. It wasn't cruelty that showed in his face. It was resolve. "I can," he replied, voice steady. "And after this morning's display, I'm considering it." The word struck like a cold wind. Ruth looked suddenly much smaller in the oversized chair, the room symbolism towering above her. An expensive chandelier threw fractured light across her designer blouse, and the sudden incongruity luxury shadowed by shame made her appear achingly human. "Please," she begged, and for all the armor she had always worn, her plea came out as brittle as dry leaves. "I'll apologize, I'll make it right, I'll do whatever you want me to do." David let the request sit for a heartbeat, as if weighing morality against mercy. He folded his hands, fingers laced, and leaned back only slightly. "This isn't about an apology, Ruth. It's about who you become." He opened his laptop again and the cool glow of the screen painted his face in soft light. A few keystrokes, and he pulled up security footage from the cafe. The images were grainy, ordinary, a camera capturing a moment that felt larger than life. There she was, Ruth, coat flung open, voice raised, face taut with contempt as customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The clip showed the way she had ordered Carolyn to take photos, the way she had pointed and mocked, the tiny humiliations that stacked together into a pattern. David let the footage play without commentary. It was not a performance for cruelty's sake, it was evidence. Ruth watched herself on the screen, and something like recognition flickered across her features. She saw the woman she had been, unrestrained, entitled, sharp, and the reflection hurt in a way she couldn't soften with excuses. "Your father built his fortune on respect and dignity," David said, not as accusation, but as a reminder of a legacy she had been handed like an heirloom. He closed his laptop softly, the finality of the action echoing in the quiet room. What would he think of this? The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Ruth's hand flew to her face, fingers splayed, as though to stop the cascade of emotion. Her shoulders shook as a sound escaped her, a raw, open sob that had no performance in it, only loss. "He'd be ashamed," she managed between breaths, the truth stabbed out of her without pretense. "I'm ashamed." There was no smugness in David's response, only a shift toward gentleness that felt like someone lowering a hand to steady a collapsing wall. Your father believed in second chances, he said. So do I, but changes need to happen. The words were a hinge sharp enough to cut, but also to open. Ruth looked up at him, panic morphing into pleading, and nodded so hard the motion seemed frantic. Anything, she said, voice cracking. Anything, tell me what to do. David watched the woman before him, the heiress who had once measured the world by brand names and social cues. The woman now worn thin by the revelation that privilege had not immunized her against consequence. He thought of the barista who'd poured coffee with silent dignity, of the elderly neighbors who'd watched over their community, of the workers whose stories rarely made the papers. He recalled the steady devotion of her father, his Tuesday coffees, the confidence he'd placed in the man before him. Community service, David said finally, choosing each syllable with deliberate care. A public commitment to repair the harm done. Hands-on work at places you've disparaged, businesses, shelters, local organizations, not a photo op, actual work. Put in the hours, meet people, learn their stories. Make a lasting contribution. Ruth swallowed and nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks like little rivers of contrition. How many hours? She asked, the logistics of penance suddenly grounding her. 200 hours, David said. He didn't flinch from the number. If anything, it felt measured enough to be meaningful, not so much that it would be dismissed as tokenism. And a significant financial commitment to support service workers' education, a scholarship or fund. Something that ties your name to empowerment, not humiliation. Ruth's breath hitched. The magnitude of the ask was immense, but so was the gulf she needed to cross to rebuild trust. She blinked hard, as if the act might steady her. And if I refuse? She asked, voice barely a whisper. I restructure the trust, David said simply. You'll receive a modest monthly allowance. The bulk goes to charities your father would have respected. Ruth's gaze dropped to the floor, shame and fear and a dawning understanding warred across her face. The path forward was steep, but it existed. For the first time that day, she glimpsed that her choices mattered not only to herself, but to the legacy she'd been given. David's tone softened, the firmness remaining, but edged with something warmer. I'll be in touch, he said. Think carefully about the person you want to be. She nodded, arms wrapped around herself as if to hold the pieces together. David closed his laptop and rose slowly. There was no ceremony in his departure, no triumphant exit, no dramatic flourish, just a man who had balanced duty with compassion and given the woman in front of him a chance to choose. As he left the room and the heavy door whispered closed behind him, Ruth sat in the dim light of the study, the document still on her lap like a map she had to learn to follow. Outside, the estate breathed with the indifferent patience of stone and lawn, and inside, a different kind of work had begun, small, slow, and necessary. The labor of becoming someone she could finally be proud of. Word traveled through Greenwich with the strange, swift accuracy of small town, soft at first, like a whisper carried between tables at lunch spots, then louder, gathering shape and color as it moved from shop to shop, doorstep to doorstep. Within 48 hours, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. Ruth Whitmore, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect pedigree, screaming at a barista inside Melanie's cafe. The video didn't need to go viral online for it to feel viral here. Greenwich had its own way of spreading truth, and in this case, the truth spread with unusual relief, as though people had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally witness the version of Ruth they themselves had endured in silence. Melanie felt her phone buzzing constantly, each vibration a new message, every ring another call from a business owner or resident who had something to say. She tried to keep working, wiping tables, rearranging chairs, double-checking inventory, but her hands kept slowing, pausing, absorbing the weight of what she was hearing. The bakery owner on Maple Street told her, "Oh honey, this isn't new, she's snapped like that for years." A florist confessed Ruth had once demanded she fix her personality as if it were a misarranged bouquet. Even the dry cleaner mentioned how Ruth had berated an employee for folding her sweaters in a tone that suggested poverty. And while the stories shouldn't have surprised Melanie, they did. Not because she thought Ruth incapable of them she had seen firsthand, but because she never expected such a long, hidden history to surface all at once, like a dam cracking open. By midweek, Mrs. Patterson, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, beloved by almost everyone in town, decided enough was enough. She marched into the cafe with a clipboard pressed to her chest and announced, "We're having a meeting. Here, tonight, bring chairs. Bring your stories, bring your voices." Melanie nodded, speechless, and simply began moving tables aside. As the sun dipped behind the slate-roofed houses outside, 20 locals gathered in the warmly lit cafe. People who rarely left their own circles now sat shoulder to shoulder, united by a shared hurt. The air held the scent of espresso and the faint sweetness of pastry's soft comforts around something raw and difficult. The first person to speak was Maria, a housekeeper with tired eyes and a gentle way of holding her hands together when nervous. She stood slowly, clearing her throat. "She fired me," Maria said, her accent musical and warm. "She fired me because she said my accent embarrassed her at a dinner party." The words trembled at the edges, but she said them anyway, lifting her chin as though reclaiming a part of herself. A hush fell over the group. Melanie felt her eyes sting. Tom, a landscaper with earth under his fingernails and kindness in his posture, leaned forward next. "She reported my truck for parking on her street. I almost lost my contract over it. Took me weeks to get the citation reversed." His jaw tightened. "I got kids. One bad month could sink us." Melanie listened to the stories not as a business owner, not as someone who had been wronged, but as a member of a community suddenly unfolding its wounds in front of her. Each new voice added another layer of truth, a thread pulled from a tapestry of experiences that had been privately carried for far too long. She realized with a slow ache that the cafe incident was merely the visible tip of something much deeper. People continued. The delivery driver Ruth had insulted for sweating on her porch. The high school teen she scolded for smelling like cafeteria food while bagging her groceries. The immigrant couple she accused of lowering the neighborhood aesthetic because of their lawn decorations. None of them spoke with cruelty, they spoke with the soft, bruised dignity of people who had endured things they shouldn't have had to endure. Then the bell over the door chimed, and every head turned. David stood there, coat still on, surprise flickering across his face as he took in the crowded cafe. He had come intending to grab a coffee and clear his head, but what he found instead was something far heavier, far more important. Melanie gave him a small nod, inviting him silently into the circle. Mrs. Patterson, never one to hold back, squared her shoulders and addressed him directly. "Young man," she said, voice firm but not unkind. "People like you with power over people like her, you have a responsibility." David blinked, absorbing the words. They struck him not as accusation, but as truth. A truth he had been tiptoeing around while managing the estate, handling numbers, analyzing spreadsheets, living in that comfortable layer where things felt objective and clean. But grief, cruelty, dignity, those were not numbers, those were human. He looked around the room, letting his gaze rest on each person, as if silently asking them for permission to understand. Maria's eyes held a sadness that lingered like a shadow. Tom's face showed the exhaustion of someone trying to support a family with honor. Melanie stood near the counter, arms folded not defensively, but to contain everything she was feeling. And in that moment, David felt something shift inside him. He realized the cafe incident had not been an outlier, but a pattern, one that had injured real people with real lives. He felt the weight of Ruth's father's trust settle more heavily onto his shoulders. His father's voice rose in his memory, warm, steady, guiding. With great power comes the obligation to protect those who can't protect themselves. The words had sounded philosophical when he was younger. But now, standing in a cafe full of people who had weathered humiliation quietly, who had been dismissed or belittled, those words rooted themselves in him with new meaning. They were no longer advice, they were a call. David inhaled slowly, letting the air steady him, and stepped forward. People watched him with a mixture of hope and caution. He knew whatever he said next could change the direction of all their lives, including Ruth's. "I didn't know," he said softly, the confession sitting naked in the air. "I knew about this morning. I didn't know the rest. But now that I do, things will change." Mrs. Patterson lifted her chin. "See that they do." David nodded. His gaze drifted to Melanie, whose eyes held both exhaustion and something like trust. He realized then that he could no longer treat his work with Ruth as a private matter, contained within legal clauses and boardroom language. It was a community matter. A moral one, a decision formed inside him, not sudden, but inevitable. A decision that would reshape everything that came after. And in that warm, crowded cafe, with 20 people watching him breathe in their stories, David chose the path his father would have chosen. He chose the harder one. He chose to act. Here is your expanded Chapter 8, written in English, with approximately 6,500 characters, staying fully faithful to your plot points and using the emotional, sensory, cathartic style you requested. David schedules an emergency meeting at the Whitmore estate. Ruth arrives looking exhausted, her makeup minimal, her designer outfit replaced with simple jeans. "I've been thinking," Ruth begins, but David interrupts. "I've spoken with your community. Your father's legacy is being tarnished by your actions." David presents a plan. Ruth must complete 200 hours of community service. Local businesses will work alongside the people you've looked down on. Learn their stories, understand their struggles. Ruth's face pales. "People will see me. They'll judge me." "Yes," David says simply. "They will. As you've judged them," he continues. "Additionally, you'll fund a scholarship for service industry workers pursuing education. $500,000 annually." Ruth gasps. "That's a huge commitment." David's expression is steel. "It's a fraction of what you spend on handbags. Your father would approve." Ruth realizes she has no choice. "And if I refuse? I restructure the trust. You'll receive a modest monthly allowance. The bulk goes to charity." Ruth looks at her father's portrait on the wall. "He really trusted you, didn't he?" David nods. "He knew I'd do what was right, not what was easy." The Whitmore estate feels colder than usual, as if the walls themselves have pulled back to watch what unfolds. The air is heavy with something unspoken anticipation, maybe fear. Ruth walks into the study with stiff shoulders and slow steps, as though each inch of movement costs her something she can no longer afford to lose. Her usual glamorous presence is stripped away. Her hair is pulled back simply, her face bare, her clothes jeans and a plain sweater look borrowed from a life that never belonged to her. She hesitates in the doorway, fingers curling into her palms. "I've been thinking," she starts, her voice frayed at the edges. David doesn't give her time to gather momentum. "I've spoken with your community." The words slam into her like a physical force. She closes her eyes, once, twice, as if she could blink away what she already knows is coming. "Your father's legacy is being tarnished by your actions." She lowers her head, shame pooling in her chest so fast it becomes difficult to breathe. There's no indignation left, no excuses. Only the hollow ache where her pride used to live. David gestures to the chair across from him. "Sit." She obeys quietly, almost gratefully, her hands tremble on her knees. He lays a folder on the table and slides it toward her. "This is what will happen next." Ruth opens it with slow, uncertain fingers. Her eyes skim the first page, and her face drains of color. "Community service. 200 hours, David says, at local businesses. Side by side with the people you've dismissed, insulted, or ignored. You'll learn what their lives look like, how hard they work, what they carry." Ruth swallows, her throat working visibly. "People will see me," she whispers. "They'll judge me." David's voice is calm, steady, unwavering. "Yes, they will, the same way you judge them." A tear slips down her cheek before she can stop it. She wipes it away angrily, only for another to fall and cling to her jawline. David turns the page for her, his finger taps the next clause. "There is more." Ruth steels herself. "Of course there is. You will fund a scholarship for service workers pursuing higher education. $500,000 annually." She looks up sharply. David, that's a massive amount." "It's a fraction of your annual spending," he replies, tone gentle but firm. "Your father believed wealth had a purpose. This aligns with his values, not the world you built around yourself." Ruth's breathing becomes shaky, unsteady. "And if I refuse?" David's posture shifts, not cruel, not triumphant, simply resolute. "Then I restructure the trust. You will receive a modest allowance. The rest of the estate will be redirected toward charities your father supported." For a moment, the only sound is the faint ticking of the antique clock behind them. Ruth turns her head slowly toward the wall where her father's portrait hangs. His eyes, painted in warm amber tones, seem to follow her, filled with the same quiet wisdom she spent a lifetime overlooking. "He really trusted you, didn't he?" she murmurs. Her voice cracks in the middle, breaking open something raw inside her. David nods, his expression softens, but he doesn't step back from the truth. He trusted me to do the right thing, not the easy thing. Ruth's shoulders slump as though a heavy armor has finally fallen away. Tears slip freely now, silent and embarrassed, dripping onto the denim of her jeans. She doesn't wipe them away this time, she lets them fall. I don't know how to fix who I become, she whispers. David leans forward slightly, his voice quieter than before, almost gentle. You start by choosing differently, not just today, but every day after. Transformation isn't loud, Ruth. It's a quiet decision you remake again and again. She nods slowly, shakily. I'll do it, all of it. For your father, David asks. Ruth shakes her head, surprising them both. No. For the woman he believed I could be. For the first time since he stepped foot into the estate, David allows himself a small, genuine smile. Then we begin, he says, and in that moment fragile, trembling, but unmistakably real something inside Ruth Whitmore shifts. A beginning, not an end, a first step toward the version of herself she once abandoned, now reaching back for her with open hands. 3 months pass as Ruth begins her community service. She works at Melanie's Cafe. Starting early mornings washing dishes, David watches from a distance as Ruth struggles with the physical work solely. Ruth begins connecting with coworkers. Maria teaches her Spanish. Tom shares his immigrant story. One day, a customer complains about Ruth's service, calling her stupid. Ruth's eyes still with tears of understanding this is what she inflicted on others. She apologizes to David and Melanie publicly in the cafe, her voice shaking. I was cruel because I was empty. My father tried to teach me, but I didn't listen. Mrs. Patterson, who's become a regular observer, stands and applauds. Other customers join in, recognizing genuine remorse. Ruth launches the scholarship fund with a ceremony honoring service workers. David gives a speech about dignity, respect, and his father's coffee shop wisdom. Ruth approaches him privately. Thank you for not giving up on me. Daddy chose well. The first weeks of Ruth's community service pass like storms. Loud inside her, silent outside. She arrives at Melanie's Cafe before sunrise, stepping into the soft clatter of dishes and the warm scent of early brewed coffee. Her once manicured hands, unused to labor, tremble slightly as she ties an apron around her waist. She avoids her reflection in the stainless steel fridge, not ready to face the woman looking back. Her shifts start at the bottom, washing dishes. The work is relentless, steam rising from the sink, water burning her skin despite the gloves, plates coming in faster than they leave. The machine hums like a heartbeat beside her, constant and indifferent. David comes by sometimes, not to hover but to witness. He leans against the far wall, arms crossed, pretending to scroll through his phone. But his eyes always drift toward her, watching her straighten her back, swallow her frustration, try again. He sees the moments where she pauses, shoulders shaking, overwhelmed by a kind of humility she's never tasted before. Slowly, painfully, something soft begins to unfurl inside her. Maria, the housekeeper she once fired over an accent, works part-time at the cafe to support her family. She surprises Ruth one morning by approaching her at the sink. You scrub too hard, Maria says gently, demonstrating a smoother motion. The plates fight back when you're tense. Ruth lets out a small, embarrassed laugh. I've spent my whole life tense. Maria smiles with a kindness Ruth once believed the world of her but now understands she must earn. Then maybe it's time to learn to breathe. Over the next weeks, Maria begins teaching her simple Spanish phrases. At first, Ruth repeats them stiffly, but gradually her voice warms. They laugh when she mixes words up. For the first time in years, Ruth laughs without cruelty nipping at the edges. Tom, the landscaper she once reported for parking on her street, delivers fresh herbs to the cafe twice a week. At first, he barely meets her eyes. But one morning, he lingers by the counter and shares his story, how he'd immigrated with nothing but determination, how losing the contract almost destroyed him. I thought you hated people like me, Tom says quietly. Ruth feels something twist sharply in her chest. I didn't hate you. I just didn't see you. Tom nods, accepting this small truth with a grace she doesn't deserve. But the true test comes on a rainy Tuesday morning. The cafe is packed, customers impatient, umbrellas dripping on the floor. Ruth is running drinks to tables when a woman snaps her fingers sharply, scowling at the latte. Ruth sets down. "This isn't what I ordered," the customer spits. "Are you stupid?" The word lands like a slap. Ruth freezes, her breath stalling in her throat. Her hands begin to tremble so visibly the mug rattles on the saucer. She whispers an apology, cheeks burning, but the sting isn't humiliation, it's recognition. This is her. These were her words. These were the wounds she carved into others without blinking. Her eyes fill, vision blurring. She places the mug down carefully, afraid she'd drop it if she holds it another second. David, seated near the corner table reviewing documents, notices. He stands immediately, concern flickering across his face. Ruth shakes her head, signaling that she needs a moment alone. But instead of leaving the cafe, she walks to the center of the room. Her legs feel like they're made of glass, fragile and transparent. Melanie looks up from the register, brows knitting in confusion. Ruth takes a shaky breath. "I need to say something." The cafe quiets, curiosity rippling through the air. Her hands are clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. "I owe this cafe, and many of you, an apology." Her voice trembles like a thread pulled too tight. "I was cruel because I was empty. I lashed out because I didn't know how to look inward. My father tried to teach me about kindness, humility, respect. But I didn't listen." She swallows hard. "I see now what I did to people, I feel it, and I'm sorry. I'm truly, painfully sorry." Silence stretches for a long, fragile moment. Then Mrs. Patterson, who has been coming daily, half to check in and half to monitor the town's newest penitent, stands with surprising strength for her age and begins to clap. The sound echoes warmly through the cafe. One by one, others join. Not everyone, not immediately, but enough for warmth to bloom in Ruth's chest, enough to make her cry openly, her tears falling without shame. In the following weeks, change becomes routine, and routine becomes transformation. When the scholarship fund is finally ready, the town gathers for the ceremony. Service workers stand in the front row, baristas, janitors, landscapers, waitstaff surprised to find themselves honored instead of overlooked. David gives a speech. He talks about dignity, respect, and the lessons his father taught him over simple cups of coffee at the little shop downtown. "My father used to say," David tells the crowd, "that the world is built on the hands we rarely look at, and that respect should rise, not trickle down." Ruth stands beside him, listening with wet eyes, her posture humble but proud. After the ceremony ends and people begin to disperse, Ruth approaches David quietly. She touches his arm gently, a gesture filled with gratitude rather than entitlement. "Thank you," she whispers, "for not giving up on me. Daddy chose well." David looks at her not as the woman she once was, but as the woman she is becoming. "Your father believed in second chances," he says softly, "and now, so do you." And in that moment, surrounded by the community she once hurt but is now learning to heal, Ruth Whitmore feels something she hasn't felt in years: hope. If you want to follow more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.